Guitars. Good for something, not so good for music at Mass. But I'd be unfairly singling out the guitar if I said that it was the only problem with the music at today's Masses. Folk bands, sappy songs, plinking pianos, rattling tambourines, pyrotechnic and psychedelic light shows. There's bigger problems than just this. Even so, I still call this one the case of the crashing guitars. Nothing should have place, therefore, in the temple calculated to disturb or even merely to diminish the piety and devotion of the faithful. Nothing that may give reasonable cause for disgust or scandal. Nothing, above all, which directly offends the decorum and sanctity of the sacred functions and is thus unworthy of the house of prayer and of the majesty of God. Such is the abuse affecting sacred chant and music. Those words come from the document Trali Solitudine, written by Pope Pius X back in 1903. Saint Pope Pius X's name is associated with many things, lots of which would probably really upset him if he were alive today. But I'm sure that if he were just remembered for this, he would be pleased. Throughout his career as a parish priest, as Bishop of Mantua, as the Patriarch of Venice, he did everything he could to foster authentic liturgical music. And when he became the Vicar of Christ, he wrote this motu proprio. Like many documents in the Church, it takes its name from the first few words, which translate to mean among the concerns. And the concerns of this document, well, they're pretty much what the quote I just read says: to make sure the music used during Mass is appropriate and sacred, rather than just religious. All right, let's get some definitions down on wax, as they say in the music biz. Do they still say down on wax? Can you still buy 45s? Anyway, some definitions and a bit of clarity. Sacred music versus religious music. You might think the two are synonymous, but they aren't. Religious music is any music which has, well, a religious theme. From our perspective, we might want to limit it to Catholic or at least Christian themes. I guess some Lebanese guy warbling in Arabic about the glory of Allah might count as religious music, but that's not what we're talking about here. There are lots of different kinds of religious music: Christian rap, Christian pop, Christian rock, Christian dubstep. Does anyone actually listen to dubstep, or is it just a big joke? I'm honestly asking. The file doesn't make it quite clear. Anyway, you'll see a pattern. Religious music exists as related subsets of existing musical genres. It is singing about religious themes, Christian themes, hopefully even Catholic themes. God, heaven, hell, sin, sacrifice, the Eucharist, the Blessed Mother. That is what religious music is. Any kind of music with a religious message. And don't get me wrong, some of it is great. Some of it is terrible, but then again, some of everything is terrible. There's bad art and good art all over the place. But if you like religious music, all power to you. Go to your concerts, listen to it on the radio, put a dime in the jukebox, spin your 45s. Just don't play it at Mass. Religious music isn't sacred music. Actually, let's expand on this case for a little, just for a moment. Religious art isn't sacred art, and only sacred art should be used in the liturgy, not merely religious or even, heaven forbid, purely secular art that happens to have a nice or uplifting theme. Stop and think just for a second about what Mass is. I've opened all of these cases, and at the heart of them is the same thing: the denial of the reality of the Mass. The Mass is not a communal meal, not merely a religious gathering or prayer service. It is the solemn representation of Christ's sacrifice on Calvary. The words and prayers of the liturgy recall this to our minds, while the movements and gestures lift our minds to comprehend it. Everything about the liturgy is, or should be, special, set apart, distinct and different from our mundane lives. Religious art, music, pictures, poems, paintings, is just secular art with a religious theme. It isn't separate, it isn't distinct, it isn't set apart for the exclusive use in the liturgy. It's part of the mundane world, and it draws us inevitably away from the sacred and towards the profane. Go back to Pius's quote: "Nothing should have place, therefore, in the temple calculated to disturb or even merely to diminish the piety and devotion of the faithful." Even merely to diminish. When we introduce things which are profane, that is, not sacred, things which are of the world, the same as our mundane lives, not separate and distinct, we diminish the separation between the Mass and the rest of our lives. The Mass ceases to be quite as special. Pope Pius was a clever man. They don't hand out the papal tiara as a party favour, you know. And he was incredibly perceptive. He is known not as the Pope of Music, although he certainly could be. He's known as the Pope of the Eucharist for his devotion to the Blessed Sacrament and his defence of the sacredness of the Mass. And all his efforts to foster and encourage authentic and appropriate liturgical music should be seen really not as merely a defence of sacred music against banal bands and clashing cymbals, but also a full-throated defence of the Eucharist against the forces of profanity and secularism. Give an inch and you will lose a mile. You might think it doesn't really matter if you allow one abuse in the Mass. What harm can it do? But abuses are like cockroaches. There's never only one. And even if they were, why would you want to make the Mass less sacred, less special? What are you gaining by giving that up? Fun? Entertainment? Amusement? You certainly aren't gaining some rocking concert, let me tell you. Like I said, if you like religious music, heck, if you like secular music, go and enjoy it. The human creature has a predisposition to music. George MacDonald speaks of the regions where there is only life, and therefore all that is not music is silence. C.S. Lewis, writing as the pernicious demon Screwtape, disgustedly describes heaven with those very words. Humans find joy in music. We listen to it to relax, to fire ourselves up, to set a mood, to send us to sleep. We listen when we work, when we play, when we work out. Music works on our passions. If music be the food of love, play on. And in that regard, we must be careful. Music is food and not merely for love. It can feed many passions within us, and sometimes some kinds of music can feed the darker passions, awakening hatred, anger, violence, sexual excess. Just as you would be careful what kind of food you put in your mouth in case it's unhealthy or poisonous, so too should you be careful what kind of music you let pass your ears. But that isn't to say secular music is bad, far from it. And I don't just speak of morality. Much of it is good in the sense that it is technically well done, proficiently played, excellently executed. In fact, and this is the point I was moving towards, much of it is better than the dreadful worship and praise dirges groaned out at the average Mass. If the goal of introducing secular-styled music to the liturgy, and this is usually the stated goal, if the goal is to entice the youth in with exciting entertainments and music they might like, you aren't going to manage it with poorly tuned instruments badly played by some patchouli-soaked band, one hippie short of a commune. The guy strumming the guitar at the average Mass is no Eric Clapton. He's not about to accompany Roger Daltrey on tour. His shredding on that axe isn't going to make him the next Carlos Santana. Your rock music is like totally bogus, dude. That is what I'm saying here. So, any music that isn't explicitly sacred is out. But there's a problem with that. It's purely negative. And I don't mean that Pius X is like totally harshing our buzz, man. I mean, all it says is what we cannot do, not what we can or should. Fortunately, Pope Pius wrote more than just the headline quote, and in our favourite document of the Second Vatican Council, the document on the liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, we find even more guidance on what music in the liturgy should be like. Of course, the idea that the Second Vatican Council, the Council, all the agents of secularization and Protestantization of the Mass and their useful idiot minions are so eager to portray as supporting their agenda, actually supports tradition and sacredness, is perhaps amazing to us. But if you've followed all these cases so far, it really shouldn't be. The Second Vatican Council, particularly the document on the liturgy, describe a wonderful renewal of the Church, a renewal that, sadly, has never been put into practice. Sacrosanctum Concilium, speaking on liturgical music, never describes any of the craziness we see today. Therefore, sacred music is to be considered the more holy in proportion as it is closely connected with the liturgical action. The treasure of sacred music is to be preserved and fostered with great care. Choirs must be diligently promoted, especially in cathedral churches. The Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as especially suited to the Roman liturgy. In the Latin Church, the pipe organ is to be held in high esteem, for it is the traditional musical instrument which adds a wonderful splendor to the Church's ceremonies and powerfully lifts up man's mind to God and to higher things. This, of course, is nothing new. It agrees with what Pope Pius X had written 60 years before. On these grounds, Gregorian chant has always been regarded as the supreme model for sacred music, so that it is fully legitimate to lay down the following rule. The more closely a composition for church approaches in its movement, inspiration, and savour the Gregorian form, the more sacred and liturgical it becomes. There is a great emphasis on singing, on choirs, specifically on Gregorian chant, and there is a reason for that. First, Gregorian chant is the singing style unique to the Church. It was born, nurtured, revised, protected, and developed within the bosom of the Church. It is utterly different from any form of secular music used exclusively for the liturgy for 1,000 years. And that, not merely the unbroken tradition, but the separation from the mundane, the profane, is what makes it sacred. But secondly, and this is such a Catholic thought, it's the one I want to use to close this case. The human voice is the only instrument made by God. We are the only creatures with a voice, and we are the only thing that, during his creation of the heavens and the earth, God called very good. We are physical creatures, not creatures with bodies, but creatures who are bodies. Our voices are an expression of our bodies. They are a way we physically interact with each other, the primary way we communicate. Faith comes by hearing, we are told. It is the Protestants who believe in sola scriptura, scripture alone, as if the Bible came before anyone preached, something the Bible itself shows to be a lie. It is supremely Catholic to give pride of place to the human voice in the adoration of worship of not just God, but God in the flesh, our King sacrificed on the throne of his cross. And so, for that reason, Pope Pius wrote, "As the singing should always have the principal place, the organ or other instruments should merely sustain and never oppress it." But let's be honest, how often do we hear that? Too often the choir, if there is one, is wailing some badly written, perhaps even borderline heretical, certainly Protestant-inspired hymn, desperately competing against some barely practiced lounge band. If the music is technically proficient at all, it inevitably starts to eclipse the central event of the liturgy itself. The Mass becomes more and more about the music and less about Christ. And that, of course, is what Satan wants and what his legions of useful idiots have given him. Here is what Satan doesn't want, what Satan hates. C.S. Lewis's Screwtape describes heaven as a place of music and silence, and hell as the audible expression of all that is exultant, ruthless, and virile. Hell is a place of noise, no silence, no music, because silence and music, good, authentic, liturgical music, elevate us. They add to the splendor of the celebration. They clothe the text with melody. Music draws the faithful so they more easily move into an atmosphere of devotion, better disposed to receive the graces of Holy Mass. Satan detests music and silence. He wants noise, raw sound to fill the silence and batter the senses so you can't think, let alone hear. He wants to leave you with no moment to contemplate the awesome mystery on the altar, because if you contemplate it just for 1 second, you might slip through his claws. He wants noise to shout down the melodies of heaven so you are not drawn upwards by those celestial songs. And so what Satan doesn't want is simple. He doesn't want silence, and he doesn't want real, elevating, sacred music. He will do anything in his power to prevent that. And that includes filling Mass with the banal pablum, crashing guitars and cymbals, applause for the band, and any number of hymns that make the liturgy seem like nothing more than an extension of our day-to-day lives. Perhaps all of this sounds just too much. It's only music, after all. Well, we started with a quote from Pope St. Pius X's motu proprio on music in the liturgy. Let's finish with one more. "We consider it our first duty, without further delay, to raise our voice at once in reproof and condemnation of all that is seen to be out of harmony with the right rule above indicated, in the functions of public worship and in the performance of the ecclesiastical offices. Filled as we are with a most ardent desire to see the true Christian spirit flourish in every respect and be preserved by all the faithful." First duty. Pius X certainly thought this important. And that, taken with everything else, is enough for me to call this case closed.